Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's event at the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm Michael Krasny, formerly host of KQED's Forum and now presently in the digital world with a new podcast called Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. I'm pleased to be joined this afternoon by David Rothkopf to discuss his new book, which is called American Resistance, the inside story of how the deep state saved the nation. David is founder and CEO of the Rothkopf Group, an international advisory firm specializing in transformational global trends. He's also the former editor of Foreign Policy magazine and previously worked on international trade policy in the Clinton administration. In American Resistance, he chronicles the unprecedented role many in the government felt they were compelled to play during the Trump administration and the consequences they faced for their actions. He focuses on the experiences of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman and his brother, Yevgeny, Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, Fiona Hill, and others who felt they needed to speak out publicly to protect our country. So we'll be talking about that, and I thought we would also talk about the elections, since David has graciously said he would be pleased to do that, and they're so close and still weighing upon us. And we're going to actually talk about the stories that he tells in American Resistance that reveal what's really at stake in our country, and I think the election has certainly highlighted and brought a good deal of that into focus. If you're watching along with us, please put your discussion in the text chat on YouTube, and we'll be getting to them later on in the program. And David Rothkopf, pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I said I listened to your most recent podcast, which is also called same title of your book, The Deep State. Maybe talk about that whole notion of the deep state also in the course of this conversation. But I thought we'd talk first about the election, and you had three guests on who really didn't believe the media and didn't believe the hype and didn't believe the narratives that were pretty much consistent with the idea that inflation and lack of popularity of Joe Biden, as well as the numbers coming across the border, those kinds of things would certainly sink the Democrats, and that proved not to be the case. And I'm just wondering at this point if we can maybe get at just how important the things were that were highlighted in your podcast as you see things. Dobbs' decision was certainly mentioned, in other words, abortion, but also the concern about saving democracy and enhancing and preserving democracy. And maybe in another sense, something that a lot of people were not even aware of that much, this new generation of the voting bloc, as one of your guests described it, Generation Z, and the role they played. You see things pretty much consistently along those lines in terms of our not being able to predict, or what we were hearing from the pollsters and the media?
Well, I think we were able to predict if you chose to listen to reliable polls and you trusted the perspective of people who had some experience. The problem is that as you get closer and closer to a big national election, there are a welter of polls, some of them reliable, some not. People use rolling averages of the polls. And so when some of the polls are not reliable, they skew the averages. Of course, we have a country that's divided into competing media bubbles, and some of those bubbles deal in facts and some of them deal in opinion. And many of the people on those programs tend to speak toward, in favor of one view or another. And so they spin the narrative. And then, as you know, there's a tendency among journalists to look for the story that everybody else is covering. You end up with kind of groupthink about what's the narrative. And you watched over the summer in June and in the first couple of months after the Dobbs decision, everybody was struck by how that had mobilized voters in places like Kansas. But as you drew closer to November, there became another kind of conventional wisdom that said the election is all about the inflation rate and the economy, and that assumed that if people were concerned about the economy, that meant they would vote for Republicans. Well, as it turned out, the Dobbs decision did drive a lot of people to the polls. It also helped engage these younger Gen Z voters. They were also, as a group, extremely interested in the issue of protecting democracy. Election deniers were defeated in all but one of the gubernatorial races in which they ran, and that one is unresolved as of right now in Arizona. You found that if you set aside the outlier polls, most of the polls showed that the Democrats were up a little bit or it was tied. And here we are after the election. And for all intents and purposes, the House and the Senate are tied. In the House, it looks slightly more likely than not that you're going to end up with a couple more Republican seats than Democrats. And in the Senate, it looks like you'll either end up with a 50-50 Senate, or, as I think is slightly more likely, a 51-49 Senate on behalf of the Democrats. And, that's a historic outcome. It's the best outcome for a president in a midterm election since John F. Kennedy. And it suggests that voters did not follow the usual throw the bums out trend, but instead said there are some issues that are so important to us that we're going to show up in high numbers, some case record numbers, because we think our democracy is at stake, and it is. And net, the outcome, while not optimal, because I think a Republican House of Representatives is going to be absolutely chaotic and obstructionist, it's certainly a lot better than it could have been.
It's also, I think, axiomatic at this point that Republicans, even if they have a majority number, which seems plausible at this point, they're going to have to deal with their own internal divisions. They're not necessarily going to be able to, as many of them have been saying, bring our president to what they see as the bars of justice, or for that matter, his son Hunter. Just remember John Boehner and Paul Ryan and all the divisions they had, particularly during the Tea Party years and even after that. Just wondering, though, if you see the election as also being, as many have said, a repudiation of the election, the last election, presidential election deniers, including, of course, most front and center President Trump himself. And the idea that Trump himself has been repudiated. It's fascinating to me now to see the Wall Street Journal and Fox News and the New York Post, these Murdoch franchises or Murdoch ownership, sort of turning against Trump, saying, he's a loser. Maybe Ron DeSantis is the guy that we should be looking at as a nominee. How much, from your perspective, is that playing in not only in the election, but now playing in what we're going to see unfolding?
Well, it's a sad fact of American politics that, kind of at 12:01 on Tuesday, election 2022 ended and election 2024 began. This elision between the two of them, it was exacerbated by, Trump saying, wait till next week on November 15th, I'm going to make a big announcement. And everybody knew what the announcement was. Many in the Republican Party are kind of horrified by that because they're concerned that he will upstage a potentially important runoff in Georgia. And we know what happened the last time he did that. It didn't turn out well for the Republicans. So there's some concern on that level. As far as repudiating election deniers, certainly, as I noted, election deniers who are running for governor were by and large repudiated. Plenty of election deniers got into the House and got into state legislatures. So to think that we're past the threat they pose to our system would be a big mistake. Having said that, I think for people who believe in the concept of one person, one vote, and the rule of law in the United States, there were some encouraging developments, notably a kind of firewall that emerged in states that are critical to the likely outcome of the next election, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, notably, in which in all of those places, election deniers were denied gubernatorial positions. They were denied positions as attorneys general or as secretaries of state. And so and in the case of Pennsylvania, Democrats took control also of the legislature. So it looks less likely that they will be able to fiddle with those important states. But having said that, between now and then, a lot can happen. And the Supreme Court could play havoc with the way the rules are set by giving more power to legislatures than currently exists, possibly giving them more power than even voters may have. And there are some election deniers that may cause problems in other states. So we
talk about the states a little bit since you've mentioned them. I mean, just I'd be eager to hear what you have to say about, for example, Arizona, where Kerry Lake is the biggest election denier perhaps of all, and it's come down to the wire there. But
well, I mean, we can sort of watch that one closely. It has come down to the wire. I've seen some reports that suggest that Mark Kelly is very likely to win the senatorial seat there, and also an even more extreme election denier, Mark Fincham, looks likely to lose in the Secretary of State race. Kerry Lake, it's not clear because she's running sort of ahead of the rest of the Republicans, and she may eke out a victory, and she would, of course, be a problem because she has been, an inveterate election denier, has attacked the press, has spread anti-Semitic tropes, she's a piece of work. And there are still states in the South where there are election deniers and in positions of power, whether it's Florida or Alabama, Mississippi, Texas. And so we've got to be on our guard there.
you also mentioned Wisconsin, and I was struck by how close that was, and kept thinking that Mandela possibly lost that election because he was perceived as too soft on crime. In that state, it seemed to be a big issue. It seemed to carry Johnson forward.
Well, I mean, Mandela Barnes was not a great candidate. The fact that he did as well as he did is a sign of what a lousy candidate Ron Johnson is. Out of touch, rich guy who, doesn't help the average person, and who played a role that was supportive regarding January 6th, and Trump's position on that. Crime is an issue that's on the minds of a lot of people. I think the right was quite deft in spinning this idea that police reform always meant defund the police. And I think some people on the left played into the hands of the right by using terminology like defund the police, which was stupid. Police reform is probably needed everywhere, but some cases it will help combat crime, and in no cases does it involve defunding the police.
You want to do a little tea leaf reading about what's going to happen December 6th in Georgia before we move on here?
Well, I guess my first prediction, and by the way, I was absolutely convinced Hillary Clinton would be president in 2016, so take all of this with a grain of salt. But my first prediction is that Catherine Cortez Masto and Mark Kelly will win. And so I don't think Georgia will be the decisive state. Secondly, I think that nonetheless, there will be massive amount of focus on Georgia, and that can't be a good thing for Herschel Walker, who is exceptionally bad on his feet and does not do well with scrutiny or hard questions. having the third party candidate who had a couple percent out of there will, be an X factor in this. But Warnock finished ahead. Warnock is won, in these circumstances before, and I would anticipate that he would win again against Walker, who's likely.
Forgive me, David, that third party candidate is a libertarian, and they tend to be more, shall we say, inclined to vote Republican, regardless of who the candidate is. That's 2%. Yeah.
Typically they do, but in this case, it's hard to determine whether people were voting libertarian because they would have liked to vote Republican, but they couldn't stand to vote for Walker. And so people who can't stand to vote for Walker might just say, I'm not showing up. Or they might say, I got to hold my nose and vote for Warnock. And so I don't know that I would translate that as you might normally do with a libertarian in another circumstance.
He's also a gay candidate in addition to being libertarian, so that makes things politically at least even more difficult to predict. But I appreciate your incisive attempt along those lines. That's Chaz Oliver, by the way, who got 80,000 votes in Georgia. Let's talk about your book because and congratulations on the book, because it's an important book, particularly about, as far as my reading goes, citizenship and the importance of public service. And you really seem to personally make a strong polemic, I mean that in the best sense of the word, for those who serve the nation in its highest ideals. And the first thing I have to ask you, since we're talking about present news, is Alexander Vindman lost his lawsuit. I wonder what your thoughts are about that against Trump, actually it was against Trump Jr. and also Giuliani. But did you feel disappointed, unhappy? What's your thoughts?
I honestly don't have any feelings about it. I saw that he lost, but the reason he lost was the judge said it was not actionable. Doesn't mean that he was treated well by these people. And I think the important thing is that Alexander Vindman is a man of character, public servant, thought he did what he, was the right thing to do, spoke truth to power, and ended up getting fired for it, lost his job, lost his career, lost his promotion, and continues to speak out. And more power to him. And the way that he was treated by Trump and Trump Jr. and others in the administration, simply because he spoke the truth, and did so in a non-political way. The president withheld $191 million Congress had earmarked for Ukraine, and it was illegal to withhold it. The reason he reported it was it's against the law. The Congress had already authorized the money. The president did not have authority to hold it up. And so he did the right thing, and he got penalized for it. And that's the bigger story. And that's why he deserves credit and, frankly, appreciation from all of us.
He also went through personal hell. But I'm wondering, I was struck when I thought about it, and I certainly don't mean this in any disapproving way of those who become American citizens, but these are all people who were born in other countries who became American citizens and adopted America and felt a love for America. Is that a coincidence that those who stood up for America were not native born?
Well, first of all, it's not true of all of them. I interviewed 100 people in my book, and a lot of the people in my book are people whose relatives arrived in this country many generations ago. Unless you're
talking about the main characters, though, of course.
Oh, but Fauci's relatives arrived generations before. Kirstjen Nielsen, Mark Esper, they're main characters in the book. They're Olivia Troy or Elizabeth Newman or others who I spoke to in the book. They're all different kinds of backgrounds. Of course, every American is an immigrant who's not indigenous, and people who come more recently are more appreciative often of the benefits of American citizenship. My father escaped the Holocaust, came to this country in 1939. By 1944, he was serving in the United States Army. And every national holiday, there was a flag hanging beside our front door because he knew what it was like to live in a totalitarian state where the state was hostile and a threat to its own people. And he was hugely grateful. My wife's parents are both immigrants, and she's probably the most deeply patriotic person I know. So I'm not surprised. And if you read Alexander Vindman's book, Here Right Matters, he talks about that. He talks about coming as a small child from Ukraine, and how he, as a consequence, has a special appreciation for the United States. But all public servants choose a job working for the U.S. government, or career public servants, when they could choose other jobs that would make a lot more money, possibly have a lot more high profile. Bureaucrats in the U.S. government are not glorified, and many, except for the people in the very top jobs, operate in some obscurity. And yet, here we have a government, the largest organization on the planet Earth, full of dedicated career public servants who sacrifice their entire lives working to serve the country and thereby other people. And that's not something we should minimize. It's not something we should minimize because to have a successful society, you need that. And it's not something you should minimize because they form an important guardrail against people who act in a way that may not be consistent with the law or the Constitution, because they take an oath to the Constitution. They're not loyal to an individual. They're loyal to the rule of law in our country. And the story of the book is the story of how time after time after time, confronted with a rogue president or people around him who were either reckless or willing to violate the law, people stood up and said, no, we're not going to go there. And they found a way to stop things from being even worse than they were. And, we all have our own memories of the Trump administration, but when you think of COVID or immigration or national security or elections or how the president dealt with civil liberties in our country, and you think of how bad they were, the reason the book is particularly interesting is absent these people, it would have been much, much worse.
Well, you make the case. You even in your introduction talk about as a young man going to Washington and just seeing that kind of dedication and commitment and being really influenced by it. What do you say to the argument, though? This will take us into this whole notion of the deep state, but what do you say to this argument that we so often hear that Washington is so overridden with not only bureaucracy, but bureaucrats, that these are people who just, punch a time clock. They don't, in other words, it's almost antithetical to the position that you take, that you've got, some extraordinary people who give public service in ways that we should champion. We should be thankful for it. It behooves us to be thankful for it. But the public perception, again, how much do we blame that on the media of this just bureaucratic, or how much of it is reality?
Well, look, no big organization is without its flaws and inefficiencies. Government bureaucracies are particularly notable for their inefficiencies, their unresponsiveness, and nobody listening here has not had experiences in which a bureaucracy, whether it's the Department of Motor Vehicles or the IRS or something else, has frustrated them. I get it. I'm not saying that everybody in the United States government is an angel or a model of efficiency. What I'm saying is that particularly at higher levels, you need to have people who recognize that there's a higher purpose, that serving others is a virtue that is to be celebrated, and that adhering to the law and to regulations and is a way of ensuring that our system works. Congress can pass a law, but unless it's enforced, we have a problem. I think I sometimes talk about Reagan's big lie as the predicate for Trump's big lie, and Reagan's big lie was, that the government is the enemy. And for most of my adult life, there have been people for political reasons saying, Reagan would tell this joke, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help, and haha, that's very funny. But, that's Washington's biggest lie. But if you're, and if you are dependent on Social Security or you're dependent on Medicare, you're glad they're there from the government and they're here to help. If you want the borders protected, then you want career military there to help you, or you want the career intelligence officers to help you, or you want career foreign service officers out there to help you. And frankly, my own experience in Washington, which goes all the way back to when I was just out of college and I was working for a congressman, and I'm embarrassed to say it, but it was 1979, 1980, that very end of the Carter administration. But most of the people I met in the government, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents, were good people trying to do good things for the American people. And it's not a popular thing to say, but thank God for them.
Well, of all those you profiled, I'm wondering, we have, and we like to think that we have in our educational system, profiles of courage. I'll use that Kennedy title. Which individual would you think would be most instructive for our children and not only our progeny, but maybe our grandchildren to look to for the kind of paradigm that you're talking about public service, dedication, and also valor?
Well, look, there are a lot of them. There are really too many to count. I interviewed 100 people for the book, and I wrote about dozens of others, who were referred to in those interviews, and so there are many examples. I'm sort of approach this in a kind of a roundabout way by saying, there were some people I talk about in the book who ultimately did the right thing, for which we ought to be grateful, after doing the wrong thing serially. Bill Barr comes to mind. He suppresses the Mueller report. He turns the DOJ into the president's own personal law firm. That's bad. But when the president said, okay, let's reject this election and run a coup, he stopped. And so, there's some people where you say, okay, he did something good and he did some things bad, and we need to see that for what it is. And I think mature adults can look at that and keep both ideas in their head at the same time. But there's some people who just time after time after time, did the right thing, not just followed the rules, but had an ethical code. And when confronted with terrible ideas, they struggled to get the right thing done. And that could include highly famous people. Dr. Fauci, I think, falls into that category, despite the fact that he is hugely unpopular in some circles and may have made some mistakes along the way. Alexander Vindman, Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, Fiona Hill, they all fall into that category. And you saw that, you saw in the January 6th hearings, a whole group of people who worked in the Department of Justice, many of which, you might not agree with on a lot of things, but who said, no, we're going to do the right thing by our own values. I think Liz Cheney, who I don't write about much in the book, although I mention her, I think she falls into that category, and I don't agree with her on almost any political issue. And then there are people you may not have heard of, or you may have seen them once or twice on TV. There's a woman named Olivia Troy who, when she was a young woman, 9/11 happened, and she said, I want to serve my country. And next thing you know, she's off in Baghdad working in the office of Ambassador Bremer, the U.S. Coalition Provisional Authority office in Baghdad. It's suffering, great risk there, and then came back and worked with the security community, the intelligence community, started with the Department of Homeland Security, trying to set things right with things like the Muslim ban, and then went over to the vice president's office on his national security staff and became his point person on the COVID task force, tried to set things right there. And, there are a lot of more people like that who you never hear of, who are genuine heroes, who are essential to having a government that, does not run amok, even when the man at the very top of it is inclined to do that.
Yeah, and we need heroes. That's why I asked the question about and you answered it pretty amplified. But those examples to our children and our next generation, we hope that notwithstanding climate change, there will be generations to come. Do you think Lynn Cheney have a political future?
Liz Cheney? Liz, yeah, I don't know what it is. I don't know when her party is going to come to its senses. I think she must have felt some sort of small degree of satisfaction watching as some of the people celebrating the values she derided and stood up against were defeated on Tuesday. I think it may be quite some time before the Republican Party comes around that way. But, she found when you talk about a political future, there are a lot of political futures. And she went to Michigan and stood next to a Democratic candidate, Alyssa Slotkin, former CIA employee, and said, no, this is the Democrat to vote for. And Alyssa Slotkin won. And she did that in a number of cases. That's a political future. That's super helpful. And she said she will run against the election deniers and the January 6th coup planners. That's a political future. That's extremely helpful. So I think that's what the immediate future holds for her. And again, you can disagree with her on every political stance she's got, but we ought to be thankful she's out there and willing to do that.
Well, like I said, you make a strong and passionate case. You may be bucking the tide because a lot of people think bureaucrats, bureaucrats, bureaucrats. And I'm just wondering, I want to look at that from bucking the tide in another way for just a moment, because it's clearly, at least to me, as a reader of your work, that you have, shall we say, I don't want to use this word loosely, but you have a partisanship where Democrats are concerned, and that I don't think you make any bones about that. And I read your piece in the Daily Beast, and I thought that was a good piece. It was co-authored by you. It was about the Republicans versus the Democrats in terms of economics. And the myth, again, that's put out there, and I think it is a myth, and you prove it to be a myth, is that the Republicans are better at handling the economy. And you kind of detonate that whole thesis, and you do it through crunching numbers. And it was a convincing piece. I showed it to a couple of Republican friends, and their response was, this is the Twilight Zone. This is, playing with numbers and everything. In other words, there's that polarization again. The inability to even accept the idea that maybe there are really honest brokers and civil servants who want to serve their country in large numbers, not taking larger amounts of money, that there are ways that you can look at the economy that are not BS, that show that the economy is handled better by Democrats. What do you do when you're facing those kinds of oppositions?
Stick to the facts and call out lies, and, when your friends say that's the Twilight Zone, I think the best response is, oh, well, what are the alternatives? What are the facts? What are your facts? And what I did in this particular case was I said, look, if you look at history, there have been 14 presidents since World War II. Of the 7 whose economies performed best, 6 were Democrats. Of the 7 whose economies performed worse, 6 were Republicans. The average GDP growth under Democrats was over 4%. The average GDP growth under Republicans was in the 2s. Every time, 10 of the last 11 recessions started under Republicans. Every Republican president oversaw an expansion of the deficit and the national debt. Every Democratic president oversaw a contraction of the deficit and under Clinton produced a surplus. Job creation, much greater under Democrats. Even in just under 2 years, Joe Biden's administration has produced more jobs, over 10 million jobs, than the last 3 complete Republican administrations combined. Record GDP growth, people being lifted out of poverty and so forth. Now, those are the facts. There aren't alternative facts on that. There's no, you might say, well, GDP doesn't matter, the deficit doesn't matter. What does matter? Job creation? That doesn't matter. Quality of life? That doesn't matter. What is it that matters? And, you might be a Republican and say, well, the stock market matters. The stock market does better under Democrats. This is, it's just, there's a myth. And, you gotta go out there and you gotta say it for what it is and be willing to calmly and convincingly lay out what's real. I mean, there's another myth that the Republicans are better at handling national security. And I would say, in the wake of the Trump administration or the Bush administration, it's kind of hard to buy into that one, isn't it? So stick to the facts. I'm a Democrat at this point, not just because I've been one for my whole life, but because I think we're at a moment in which we all need to be single issue voters. Democracy is at risk. One party is pro-democracy. One party is anti-democracy, pro-authoritarianism. And there's a massive amount of evidence that supports that. And I think, if we're going to make a stand, we got to make it now, because if we carve voting rights away more, if we give people with money more and more rights to influence elections, less and less accountability, if we gerrymander more, if we give legislators and at the state level more and more authority to contramand the will of the voters, et cetera, we'll be a democracy in name only. Our children will not have the benefits that people have had in this country for the past 250 years, acknowledging for a moment that people of color and women didn't have those rights for a long part of that. And, I think that, I'm not ashamed to say I'm a Democrat right now. I'm proud of it. And frankly, I don't know how anybody who cares about the country can say anything else.
And by the way, I want to remind those of you who are listening, you can join us in the YouTube chat with any questions that you may have. We'll go to them shortly. I go, since we're talking about Democrats, you also hear the argument that the squad and those on the, shall we say, far left, some people even say Bernie Sanders, are hurting the Democratic Party or causing, let's say, too much of a rift or division or taking away from their bona fides. What do you say to that?
Well, I say that's nonsense. I mean, there are people in both parties who are too extreme and have too extreme views. I don't think, for the most part, that Bernie Sanders or the squad fall into that category. And in fact, I think they've helped open the discussion to a number of things that have evolved more towards the mainstream. And, I call myself a 70%er. I think there's an agenda that polls show 2/3 or 70% or more of the American people support. I think they support the idea of fairer taxes so the rich pay their share. I think they support the idea of better health care so that everybody has health care as a coverage as a right. I think they support the idea of common sense gun laws or women being able to have control over their own bodies, reproductive rights. I think they, support the idea of, more racial equity, of taking care of climate. Well, some people would say if I laid all those out, that's a progressive agenda, but it's not. Poll after unbiased poll says that's the agenda of the majority of the American people right now. The Democrats, in order to win elections, need to embrace progressives and centrists because you need the most numbers. At the end of the day, it comes to arithmetic. And I think one of the things that Joe Biden has been able to do surprisingly well, I didn't expect it, but it turned out to be the case, was provide some things that respond to progressives, including the biggest amount of money allocated to fight climate change, relief on some portions of student debt, programs to help people who are in dire need, particularly in the wake of COVID, some things that are more on the agenda of centrists, like investments in infrastructure, strong defense, masterful handling of the situation in Ukraine. And so what do you end up with there? You end up with a balance and a lot of support and the kind of election result we've just seen. Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by 4.5% in the popular vote. And he's just had the most successful midterm outcome since John F. Kennedy. Plus, the economic performance we've been talking about. So I'm not ashamed of taking the position I take, and I'm not ashamed to call myself a progressive, because I think the views of progressives are now the views of the majority of Americans.
And when you call your book American Resistance, aren't these people who were just exercising their belief in the Constitution and the country, were they really resistors?
They were, and some of them, objected to the term American resistance. And I talk about that a little bit in the book. I just did podcast yesterday. We're doing a mini series of podcasts around the book at Deep State Radio, which is our podcast at the DSR network. And I did it with Fiona Hill, and Fiona talked a little bit about that, but I used the title because that they were just doing their jobs, yes, but at some point or another, they had to stop and speak truth to power to a rogue president of the United States. They had to resist pressure to do things that were wrong, whether it was launch an attack on Korea, launch missiles against Mexico, shoot incoming immigrants, put alligators in a moat along our southern border, ban people from this country because they were Muslim or people of color, not provide COVID assistance to blue states, or hide data about what was really happening with COVID, or drop the 101st Airborne Division in to stop George Floyd related protests. They stood up and they didn't let those things happen. We'd be a lot worse off if they didn't. And so I think describing them as American resistance, as Americans who stood up to a dangerous force in our midst, is a compliment. And although I respect the views of those who were slightly uncomfortable with it, they came around to accepting the description when I talk about it as I just did.
And all the things that you just mentioned, notwithstanding, and it's quite a catalog. This is a rogue president who got 70 million votes, despite 2 impeachments, despite everything that you just so nicely enumerated for us. That gives you pause. It should. And I wonder what you say about that, particularly in light of the fact that if it hadn't been for COVID, perhaps he might have been reelected. 70 million people.
Well, look, I mean, we have a democratic system in the United States, and there are losers and there are winners, and as you know, Joe Biden got 4.5% more votes than Donald Trump did, and won substantially in the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton got more votes than Donald Trump did, but because the way our system works, where we give disproportionate a weight in the Electoral College to some less populated states, something we ought to change. It's antiquated, but we're not going to change. We have to live with the consequences of that system. Having said that, those 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump did not either intend or have the right to have Donald Trump set aside the Constitution, or ignore the roles of the Congress or the courts, or put American national interests at risk. And military officers are trained to say yes, sir, and support the chain of command. But if the military officer gets an illegal order, it's their obligation to say no, sir. And the same is true of people throughout the government who, if somebody says to them, do this thing, it's illegal, they have an obligation to say no, sir, or to go to go through a whistleblower channel, or go to an inspector general, or go to the Congress, or go to the press, because no matter how many votes you get to be president of the United States, the people are in charge in our system, and the Constitution takes precedence over the whims of any individual.
I'm going to go to your questions, those of you who are with us Just quickly, though, David, if you would, talk a bit about the notion of the deep state, because for a while it was used by the right, and it was used quite recklessly, I think it's safe to say, by the right, to suggest that there was some kind of conspiratorial operation going on.
Yeah, it definitely was. It's used by the right. I mean, it was a term that's been around a long time. It's, there always have been rumors, about little conspiracies behind governments since the dawn of time. The term deep state actually, emerged from Turkey decades and decades and decades ago, but it became popular in the United States around the time of the 2016 campaign. The right seized upon it to vilify the government and to suggest that there was a unelected government that was hijacking the country. And you have to ask yourself. I mean, first of all, the U.S. government's the biggest organization in the world, and the idea that it's somehow there's some conspiracy within that is a little implausible, particularly for anybody who's seen it in action. But you have to ask yourself, why were they doing it? And the real reason for it is the same as the reason behind calling things fake news, even though they're the truth. What you're trying to do is you're trying to discredit a potential threat. Trump didn't want the truth run. The far right doesn't want the truth run because the truth doesn't serve their interests. And the same is true with these people who take an oath to the Constitution and place it above serving a party or an individual. And they wanted to target them because they saw that they might be an obstacle. And that's evolved over time because these people really did impede some of Trump's worst ideas. By the end of the administration, Trump was getting rid of people, putting in acting people who weren't, put in by congressional or Senate confirmation. And he imposed this thing called Schedule F, which was created to allow him to fire these people because, they were screwing things up by saying, no, sir, the law doesn't allow that. And now that, although Biden reversed that idea, now the mass, across the leadership of the Republican Party want to go back to this Schedule F idea. And you have to see that for what it is. This is not bureaucracy. It's not some boring thing. It's getting rid of a guardrail in the same way that loading the Supreme Court with right-wing extremists is getting rid of a guardrail. And if you do it, and if you stop having people in departments in the U.S. government who say, no, you've got to follow the law, the Constitution, the will of the Congress, the will of the people, that's a step towards authoritarianism. And so we really need to look at these people, not just to appreciate them, not just to realize how bad things could have been under Donald Trump, but also to recognize that if they weren't there, we would be in a very, very dire position. And that's the goal of the MAGA GOP. They want to get rid of the independence of these people and turn the government into an organization that serves an individual or a party.
You've done a nice job of co-opting that more right-wing attitude that comes across in that deep state. Let me go to some questions here. The first one says, so listener, viewer says, I'm hopeful that even if the balance of power shifts in the House, there will still be enough Republicans who hear the American people and continue providing strong support to Ukraine. We must. How do you see it?
Absolutely agree. The people of Ukraine are fighting to protect democracy. They're fighting against a country that is one of our most dangerous enemies. They are weakening that country. They are protecting our allies in Europe, and they deserve our support as they have gotten it from the Biden administration. The fact that Kevin McCarthy, who might become the Speaker of the House, has said that there will be no more blank checks. Well, that sounds innocuous enough. Goes along with the fact that there were scores of Republicans who've opposed aid to Ukraine in the past, and that now recent polls have shown that it's about a 50-50 split within the Republican Party about providing more aid to Ukraine. If we don't provide aid to Ukraine, if we allow Ukraine to fall further, to the Russians or to Russian pressure, or if we reward Vladimir Putin for his violation of international law and his war crimes, then what we're going to end up with is a more dangerous world. And we've seen that every time Vladimir Putin gets away with this stuff, he does something worse the next time. And so it is profoundly and on many levels in the U.S. national interest to support Ukraine. And fortunately, I think there's a substantial majority in the United States Congress, even the new Congress, between Democrats and Republicans who are, of sound mind on this, that that aid to Ukraine will continue as intended, unless McCarthy and others come up with procedural barriers for this, and that would be an incredibly dangerous development.
But once you can see that there are many, I'm thinking about people like Trump, who is, if anything, almost sycophantic to Putin. There are many others, though, especially in the media. Think of Tucker Carlson, who's unsympathetic where Ukraine is concerned, or more sympathetic, one could argue, to Putin and Russia, in terms of really helping and assisting Ukraine to the extent that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole number of people in the party who have taken,
and they're influential in the Republican Party.
Yeah, no, they've taken the position of Vladimir Putin. Tucker Carlson might as well work for Pravda. He might as well work for RT TV, Russian television. He spews Russian talking points left and right, and there are a whole host of others within the party who have taken up this point of view, and I find it astonishing. I found it astonishing when Donald Trump, running for president in 2016, said, "Russia, do you hear me? Russia, support me," and he embraced Kislyak and Lavrov in his office and handed them secrets, and we all knew about it. And he gave Russia break after break and said, "Hey, while we're at it, let's dismantle NATO. Let's pull our troops out of Europe. Let's do all these things that are the high items on the Russian agenda." And the American people were like, "Oh, okay." I mean, this was our enemy. I grew up in the United States in the 1960s, when there were air raid drills, and we would go out, we would put our coats over our head because we were afraid of an attack by Soviet Union, by the Russians back then, and it was always a kind of a pillar of republicanism to take a strong stand against our enemies, to be for a strong U.S. national defense, to take a strong stand for democracy and freedom. And they've just flipped the script on that one. They're supporting autocrats. They took democracy off the agenda of the State Department while they were in there. And they've done things to aid and abet our enemies overseas.
And I remember people laughing at Mitt Romney saying the greatest fear we have is Russia, or wondering about George W. Bush saying, "I looked into Putin's soul and I saw." Well, let me go to another question here.
No,
this is somebody who says, "You've written that you don't think DeSantis will succeed on the national level. Why?"
A few reasons. First of all, Florida is not the United States. Secondly, DeSantis has a terrible record on a number of things, trying to suppress COVID data, threatening and actually firing people in the Florida government who expressed views that didn't agree with his own, dealing with, self-dealing with friends and allies in the government on a variety of different kinds of contracts, kicking the press out of public meetings just because he just didn't want the criticism. He's also proven he's lousy at debate. In the recent debates with Charlie Crist, when he said, "Are you going to are you going to stick around for your whole term of office?" It looked like he was presented with advanced quantum physics equation that he couldn't quite get his brain around. His kind of eyes crossed. He didn't know how to respond to it. He is charmless. He is thin-skinned. Donald Trump is going to spend the better part of the next 2 years trying to destroy DeSantis.
He's already threatened him and said, I know things about you that nobody knows."
No, it's right, and he's going to do that. And by the way, I'll pay for a ticket to watch that. But so the point is, DeSantis is not a national candidate, and every election cycle, 2 years before the election, people will tell you with absolute certainty, who the next candidate's going to be, and President Scott Walker and a whole host of President Jeb Bush, our testimony to the fact that we don't know.
President Marco Rubio.
And President Marco Rubio, right? We get it wrong, right?
Yeah. So, any predictions about 2024 and the presidential race? You think it'll be Trump? It could be Trump and Biden again, couldn't it?
Could be. Don't think it'll be Trump. I think Trump's going to have a bunch of legal troubles. I think Trump has got the party turning against him at the moment. I think the fact that Trump has essentially presided over 3 losing efforts for the GOP is really the kiss of death. I don't think they care about election denying or the coup or playing footsie with the Russians so much as losing, because it's all about power in Washington, and I don't think they think he'll advance that. I think it's much more likely that you end up with some sort of Trump light that isn't DeSantis, maybe Youngkin, or some variation on the Carrie Lakes of this world. But we'll have to see what Biden says. Biden says he's planning to run. If he doesn't, then the Democrats have a pretty good bench. I think 2024 will be about democracy again, first and foremost. I think there will be massive numbers of legal battles around what it looks like as an election. But I do think I think the economy is going to be in much better shape. I don't think that's going to be a central issue. I do think that America's position in the world will be stronger, and I think Russia will have suffered a real setback, and Biden foreign policy will look pretty good. You've already established that I'm a Democrat and a progressive, so you may not give much credence to what I'm saying, but right now, I think the prevailing winds favor Democrats.
Well, who are these Democrats on the bench, as you see it? Who would be good presidential candidates?
Well, first of all, I'm happy to talk about it, but I want to be absolutely clear. If Joe Biden runs, he deserves our support. But in the future, you've got some good governors. You saw some of them being elected the other day. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Gavin Newsom in California, and others. And I think governors who have real executive experience make better candidates than senators, despite what senators may think. And I think there's some young blood. I also think the Democrats have this demographic advantage. The country is changing, and much of the direction it's changing favors them, not just in terms of the racial mix of the United States, but in terms of the growing influence of Generation Z and others who really prioritize issues like climate, and in a way that makes their party affiliation much more naturally towards the Democrats.
We're getting pretty close on time here, but maybe one more question. Somebody wants to know if you could go deeper. You've been prognosticating a good deal, and I appreciate your doing that. But the significance of the Kherson retreat, how do you see things unfolding now in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I think it's very significant. Getting Kherson back is important to denying Russia the gains that they made in the early part of this war. It opens up the possibility of moving into the Zaporizhia region, getting back some of the access, the access to the sea that is so important to the country, economically and strategically. It obviously puts Crimea back in play as they move in that direction. Kherson, also puts you in the position of potentially being able to split the Russian forces in the north and the Russian forces in the south. And I think, President Zelensky's done a masterful job in leading this effort. And he's been very clear that his position is Russia should occupy not 1 centimeter of Ukraine as it existed in 2014. I'm not sure whether that's going to be the final outcome, but that's got to be the way he approaches it. And we deserve, and he deserves our support, because ultimately the final decision on what borders are acceptable to the Ukrainians is up to the Ukrainians.
There's a lot of fear, though, about Putin getting desperate, particularly as he doesn't move in the way he wants to on the ground or in the air. Do you think he's capable of using nuclear weapons?
Look, Putin is capable of it. I just don't think he's going to do it. And I think he's not going to do it because he's had very clear messages from the United States and our allies, and I think also from the Chinese, to say that there would be a tragic mistake, not just to the victims of it, but to the people of Russia, because what would happen immediately after that would be, kind of isolation that no major country has known in modern times. The United States would likely shift its position on some weapons programs to Ukraine, including providing Ukraine with missiles that could strike within Russia. Obviously, NATO's alert status would change, and there's no gain. But Putin might launch a tactical nuke over the Black Sea, but at the end of the day, if he launches a nuclear attack in Ukraine with the prevailing winds, he might be putting Russia in great jeopardy. And of course,
that's exactly right.
And if he does anything that threatens any part of NATO, Article 5 says all of NATO will, move against him. And I think he has to understand that poor, relatively ill-equipped Ukraine has taken his vaunted army, the second best army in the world, and kicked the crap out of them. And NATO is a whole different kettle of fish, and it would amount to the end of Putin's Russia. And I think he knows that.
David Rothkopf, it's been a real pleasure. I'm sorry we don't have more time, but let me again instruct people to take advantage and avail themselves of your book. The book, again, is American Resistance, the inside story of how the deep state saved the nation. And again, pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. And we also like to thank our audience for watching and participating live. And if you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making programming, please visit commonwealth.org/online. Thank you, and everybody, stay safe. I'm Michael Krasny.